Well, bore da. Good morning, bore da. So whenever I come and share, there's often something new or unexpected that's thrown at me. I think one of those times I clearly remember we had started gathering back, but then the one time that I was speaking, we were back on Zoom because there was some fire alarm going off here or something. But then Owen was like, there is something new happening. We're upstairs. I was like, that's a good news. That is definitely a good news. And you know what? As we just gathered and worshipped together and just felt almost that closeness as church family and as well as just intimacy with God and in prayer, I could just sense it. I was like, this for now anyway, doing very well, might outgrow it. Because Owen was like, there's loads of people away this week, and I'm looking around like, there's loads of people away. We're bursting at the seams, but you can deal with that problem some of the time. But it's so good. It's so good to be with you and to share some of our story. We appreciate all of your encouragement and prayers along this past year. As I was saying, it hasn't been an easy year. You go from kind of talking about the dream and dreaming about the dream to then actually living that dream, and living that dream is way grittier and way less glamorous and romantic than you had in your mind, but actually it's also way better, isn't it? Because as in, you know where God has you and you get to meet those people and you just think to yourself, as in, it is so true, as in, you have people for us in this place, and so that is why we are here, God. So thank you so much, Grace, for all your support and continued support, I hope, as well, along the way. We are going to be in Luke 14. I'm a bit like, what do you reckon? I can go mic if you want.
Just switch the microphone up.
Yeah, I've got a loud enough voice, haven't I? Anyway, we'll go handheld. Lovely. Better. Luke 14, carrying on the stories in this passage in Luke. And I wanted to take you firstly to the year 2016. You're in my student accommodation in Manchester, crammed into our living room area where I lived with 5 other rugby lads, so you can probably imagine the scene anyway. But it's Tuesday night, and on these Tuesday nights, through the encouragement of a friend, I just started these evenings of inviting the rugby team over for food, for just time to hang out, but also the opportunity to look at stories of Jesus together. And it completely blew my mind how many of them actually came. We were literally on top of each other, didn't have enough sofa space, and ended up piling on top of rugby tackle bags and everything like that. But it was a really, really sweet time. And there's one boy that stands out in particular, the club captain, the club legend of that time, had started coming, and I'd completely written him off. And it was to my shame that I'd written him off, because as he arrived and he kept coming week in and week out, you could tell, almost like by his posture every week, he went from being confrontational, oppositional, and kind of wanting to catch you out with many scientific arguments, him being a physicist and everything like that, to, as the weeks went by and we shared food and sat together and talked, you could see these were questions he was asking of searching and of hungering and of looking at this seriously. And I'll never forget the evening when we wrapped up our year together, and he pulled me aside and he said to me, "Look, Jos, you have no idea what was going on in my life the moment you invited me to this evening to have these meals with you." Funnily, I didn't share with him, but I only initially shared with a really small group of lads who I knew would come because they kind of were my mates and would support me. But I was encouraged by that friend. No, send it out to the whole rugby team. Let them decide if they want to come. And this was one of those boys, and he said, "You have no idea what was going on in my life. My life was a wreck. I had just had to stop that week my own housemate from taking their own life. And my world was just all thrown into question. But here," he said, "these Tuesday nights, as we gather for food, as we talk, we get to talk about things that matter," he said. "We talk so much rubbish, but on Tuesday nights, we get to talk about things that matter, and Jesus seems to be making sense to me more and more every time." I came away, as in, obviously blown away by that, but I look back and I think to myself, there's something, isn't there, about the dinner table. There's something about sharing meals with one another that is just deeply formational, isn't it? I don't know if you can look back to your own life and think of moments around the dinner table, moments around the gathering, eating with friends or family that was just deeply significant for you. I don't know what comes to your mind. As in, my family is known for this. When Lydia entered in, she just couldn't quite believe how much emotion there really was around the table. It was just like, oh, come on, isn't you crying? And I was like, why? But do you know what? I look back and I appreciate that my mum would sometimes intentionally, most of the times around the dinner table were very mundane and, nothing to write home about. But there were some moments where she would deliberately just stop the just everyday chatter and just ask us to go around and share something about, as in one another, that we either loved or just could see that was just, that was just good. And those were those evenings where you just come away built up and encouraged, but it was always around the dinner table. And I find that interesting because we're in this second part of Luke's Gospel. I'm kind of jumping in on this journey once again with you. And what we see is we're in this second part that's been launched in chapter 9, where Luke, the writer, notes that Jesus, what's he done? He's now set his face on Jerusalem. Jesus is now heading on the journey. The Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, he's a traveller. He's on a journey, and where is he headed? He's headed, knowing his destiny, towards Jerusalem. And yes, that would be a solemn journey, you would think. You'd think it's a sober one, because he knows what awaits him. And yet, we see it in these stories, that Jesus, on the way, he took time to sit around the table. He took time to be with people, to eat with them. And he took time to share stories, down-to-earth stories, that invite us into really his way of seeing life, the kingdom that he was bringing, and what really matters most. And so this morning, I want us to hear that we are invited as well. This is almost, and I love that we're up in this room where we feel just closer together anyway, because we're invited by Jesus to come round the table with him and to talk about things that matter, to listen to his words, these words that he had as a man headed to the cross, knowing where his journey was going. We then feel, don't we, the weight and the urgency of the words that he has, because he knows where he is headed. And I think in our busy and complicated world, we need to get around the table with Jesus more, don't we? We need to be reminded of the things that matter most. And what we're going to see this morning is two really simple things. Jesus invites us into what? Well, firstly, we're going to see into walking humbly. We're going to see that, and then we see Jesus inviting us to do justice, because these things, he is saying, are what matters most. So firstly, we're invited to walk humbly. Did you notice it in the reading? Jesus has been invited to dinner by a ruler of the Pharisees. And what is going on? Well, he's being carefully watched, because a test has been put in place before him. What we hear of is a man suffering from abnormal swelling is there, and everyone's watching, because the question is Jesus going to heal this man on the Sabbath? That is the tension that is in the air. That is why the guests have gathered, because they probably knew there was this test being set up for Jesus. And what does Jesus do? Well, he cracks on regardless, doesn't he? He goes ahead and heals the man, sends him on his way, and then goes on to expose the state of the hearts of the people that were watching. That's the whole point. Where Jesus thought he was, and where people thought that Jesus was under a test, actually we see Jesus flipping things around. And I want to spend time just in verses 7 to 11 here, because I think what we see is, as Jesus notices in verse 7, of the people, they're jostling for positions around the table, aren't they? They're trying to get to the higher honourable positions. And Jesus is comparing their just social etiquette, almost the way they were going about their time around the table, as a revealer of what they were truly like. And what he's saying is, ultimately, for those gathered, you've lost sight of what matters most. So we see it here in verse 7. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honour at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honour, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seats. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honoured in the presence of all the other guests. Now, hearing this pretty down-to-earth story from Jesus takes me back to the worst part of planning a wedding, which is the seating arrangements. Anyone else resonate with that? I hated it, and I still look back and I'm like, ugh, glad I'm not doing that again. But I also am reminded that I forgot one table to actually place the names in the right places. So we just had one table that was just completely random, where there were just people who did not know each other, sat next to each other, and Liz looks back and is absolutely fuming at me, like, how could you have missed that table? Oh, it was so awkward, no one knew each other, all of that. So forgive me please, Lydia, for that. That's what first came to mind, but actually as I was reading about it, what we see here firstly is, this is just good practical wisdom from Jesus, isn't it? This is what would have happened in Jesus' day, that seating was associated with honour, with relationship. So if you would have put yourself higher up, nearer the host of the dinner, you then, if you were told to go down, would have felt that shame and humiliation, because as in you clearly thought, I think I deserve, this is where my relationship is to this person, and when you're told to go further down, clearly you feel that shame. So it just makes sense, doesn't it? Sit lower down. So that, if they pull you up, you don't feel humiliation, you feel honoured, you feel as in that your relationship is further on. So we see there is just practical wisdom from Jesus here. But also, and this is something we've got to note just about the way this Jesus told his stories, there is also a double meaning. There's also more to it than what meets the eye. And what we see here is actually the guests who are elbowing their way into the places of honour around the table. Jesus is almost comparing that social etiquette, that way of going about the dinner, to what they were like really in the sight of God. What they were doing, their social behaviour reveals their heart condition. And what is that? Well, they were so eager to show how well they kept the law. And they were so eager to get ahead of others and to put themselves at the higher seats in God's eyes. And so what do? We see it, don't we? They tested Jesus because they were more eager to pick out the irregularity of Jesus' law keeping than they were concerned with seeing a man suffering being healed. This is what their hearts were like. They wanted to prove themselves and show how well they were keeping the law. But Jesus, well, we see, he saves his harshest words for them. Why? Because they've lost sight of what matters most. This is a pattern we see throughout Luke's Gospel. In chapter 11 already, if you think back, Jesus already described these Pharisees as being full of greed and wickedness. Why? Because all they cared about was cleaning the outside of the cup. And guess what? That outside of the cup looked pretty clean. They were good at what they did. They were unmatched in their rule keeping. But God is about the within, isn't he? This is what Jesus says. You neglect justice and the love of God. Your pride, your obsession with the external, Jesus says, has caused you to lose sight of what matters most. And what matters most is loving God and people. And so Jesus says to them plainly, he is very clear about where they are headed. And where they're headed, we see it in verse 11. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. This has always been God's way throughout the entire biblical story. This is not new. This is, and if you would say, what is the principle of the kingdom when Jesus preaches this? It is this. This to him is what matters most. And so if we push ourselves forward before God, if we find ourselves, and we live in a world that may not say religion is our thing anymore, we might not be trying to push ourselves before God in his sight, but we still do in many ways, don't we, in front of others perhaps. We're taught, aren't we, to look after ourselves first. We're told not to cross bridges for those who've never crossed bridges for us. We're told to build platforms online and to showcase the best of ourselves. We're told that you can climb the ladder. You can, if you meet the right people and network and whatnot, that place of honour is rightly yours, and don't worry about who is left behind in that pursuit. We live in a world, don't we, that yes, we might not have the same religious problem as the Pharisees had, but our problem is still as religious as them. It's just not in the sight of God, it's probably in the sight of others. And what we see here is, if we're chasing that, if getting ourselves ahead of God or of others is our pursuit, then we are setting ourselves up for what? For the greatest of falls. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. But what we see is that pride, yes, it is our great problem. It is what we see, the Bible describes it, all sin is in every rejection of God's good things and good ways for our lives to flourish. It actually stems to this. It finds its roots in this problem, which is pride. And I just thought there's a helpful quote that I came across in my reading for this from a theologian called N.T. Wright that just sums up really what pride does to us all. Pride notoriously is the great cloud which blots out the sun of God's generosity. If I reckon that I deserve to be favoured by God, not only do I declare that I don't need his grace, mercy and love, but I imply that those who don't deserve it shouldn't have it. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. But the antidote is clear here from Jesus, isn't it, when it comes to pride? What is the answer? I think it's beautifully simple in this story. Choose the lowest seat. That is Jesus, his answer. That is his way. That is the way into his kingdom. But that also is the way of his kingdom. You know, Tim Keller, another famous pastor theologian, says this about what humility is in reverse to pride. Humility isn't thinking of yourself less, is what he says, but it's actually thinking of yourself less. And I love that as a picture of what humility is. It actually starts with a right knowledge. It starts with a true understanding of ourselves. How do we measure up when it comes to us and God? But it doesn't just stop there. It's not about just us looking at our own selves. But actually humility really starts when we get our eyes off of ourselves and onto God. And what do we see there is we see the great host of the banquet. The one who's gathered round the table, we've noted already. Where's he headed? He's headed to the cross. The only one worthy of honour. The only one who had right to exalt himself. The only one who could push himself ahead. What does he do? He chooses to be humiliated. He soon will be crushed. He will be at the bottom of it all. He descends into death. Why? So that we can be raised to life. That is what we see. The cross of Jesus opens the way for all who are humble to be exalted. So if pride is the great cloud that we heard there that blots out the sun of God's generosity, what is Jesus? Jesus is that fresh, healing sunshine of God's love that clears those clouds away. Pushing ourselves forward then in light of the cross makes no sense at all because we see it cost God everything to save us. But when we live our lives on our knees, when we walk humbly before him, what we're invited into is real life. Because we see it here, don't we? There is no humiliation to the ones who choose the lowest seats. Because our eyes, they're no longer on ourselves. We're not trying to see how do we measure up before God and others. We are no longer concerned with ourselves. We are just concerned with the host of the banquet. The one who has seen everything about us and still invites us. still says, calls us by name and says, pull up a chair here with me. All those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So we are called, what matters most? To walk humbly. But secondly, we're called, and we see it in the next story Jesus gives us, we're called to do justice. Jesus goes on in the story from addressing the guests to then the host of the banquet, and this is what he had to say to him. Then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbours. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now again, we've just got to do some work in entering into Jesus' day here, don't we? And there was a thing that ruled, a social system that ruled the time of Jesus' culture, and that was what you'd call the Patronage System. And this was the only way you could get ahead in a world that was just completely hierarchical. Okay? There was clear social classes, there were clear stratas, and you really knew, because of the time, where you fitted in society. But you could get ahead, but the only way you could get ahead is if you were able to start associating yourself with the people who are above you. And those people who are above you, they would be willing to associate with you, but only if you could offer something of benefit to them. And so what we see here is the way these relationships, the way these alliances would form for people to advance, for people to improve their lives, was at these banquets, was at the dinner table. And so this is what we see here from Jesus, really, when you consider the time, where you consider, yes, well, of course, that's why I invite the rich, that's why I invite my peers to the banquet, because they're my way of getting ahead. When Jesus says, no, do not invite them, but invite those who could never pay you back, it just sounds like economic and social suicide, really, doesn't it? Because there's nothing for you to gain. You are not going to get ahead that way. And it wasn't just unheard of, this talk from Jesus. It just would have felt like pure foolishness. Now, it's important that we do qualify quickly what Jesus is saying when he talks about these things. He is not saying that you cannot ever have friends or family around the dinner table. I think that's just important that we qualify that. If so, last night, like I'm out the question, I've already had friends around the dinner table last night. But what Jesus is saying here is, and he does this is kind of how people would have spoken at the time to really emphasize the points. Similarly to earlier in Luke, Jesus says, what does it look like to follow me? Well, it means to hate your father and mother. And now initially we read and we're like, oh, that just sounds jarring. And it should jar us, because actually that is not what the Bible teaches. But Jesus says something like that to emphasize a point. And it's to emphasize that your love should be so great, so devoted and passionate towards me, that it almost looks like you hate your father and mother. It's not to say that you do, but it's just in comparison. And I think it's the same point here. Jesus is saying that our preference, our time, our generosity should so favour the poor and the outsider that it almost looks like rejecting our family and friends, doesn't it? It's important that we hear that, and I came across just one of the beautiful quotes that sums it up way better than I could. John Newton, when he reflects on these words, says this: one would almost think that Luke 14, 12 to 14, was not considered part of God's word, nor has any part of Jesus' teaching been more neglected by his own people. I do not think it is unlawful to entertain our friends, but if these words do not teach us that it is in some respects our duty to give a preference to the poor, I am at a loss to understand them. I read that and I think to myself, how have we got to this? How have we got to the stage where Luke 14 is no longer, when we look at our churches, considered a part of God's word? How has it become so neglected within the people of God? Because what we've just seen, what we've just heard about the one who goes to the cross, we are saved by faith alone. But that it just cannot remain alone. It cannot stay there. Otherwise, it's not real saving faith. And as we search the scriptures, as we look through the whole story, what do we see? We see a God whose heartbeat is for justice. His heart is for all, people from all backgrounds, all streams of life, walks of life. But what do we see? His preference, his heart, it is just drawn naturally to the poor, to the outsider, because often they are the ones who are victims of injustice. And so what does God describe himself as? He's a defender of the poor. He is a defender of the oppressed. And so what we see in the Bible, the ethic isn't as our world, which is survival of the fittest. The ethic of the Bible is it's all about protection of the weakest. And when you look at Jesus, and we've seen it even in Luke's gospel, this is a huge theme in Luke's writing. It's this, that he is the anointed one who has come to preach good news to who? To the poor. And so it is to our shame, isn't it, that John Newton, and that was back in the 17 or 1800s? Oh, I'll have to check that. But he could say that of his church in that day. And I look at the church of today and I still feel like this remains true. Because for Jesus, it didn't make sense. The most natural outworking of salvation, of the very life we've experienced, that grace that God has poured out to us on the cross, is what? It is to welcome the poor, the hurting, the disabled, those without influence. So as we look to Jesus on the cross, yes, we're confronted by our own need and our own powerlessness. But also, we should then be drawn to those who are in need and powerless in our world. Our preference should be for the poor, but look at how Jesus says we should approach this. How should we engage in this? It is not just to throw money or to kind of meet needs from afar. Jesus says, doesn't he? We invite people in. Hospitality. And that word is loaded these days with all sorts of connotations. Often we think of cookbooks, and I think of our posh lounge in our house in Ballard. Did any of you have a posh lounge? There was a living space where we all lived our lives, but when guests were over, we went into the posh lounge. We weren't allowed there any other time, but the posh lounge was there for guests, and they could never leave either because the rest of the house was just not acceptable for them. I wonder if you had something similar. But that is what comes to our mind, isn't it, when it comes to hospitality. But actually, the Bible, we look at the original meaning of this word, hospitality. What does it mean? It means a love of the stranger. It means welcoming, and not just welcoming, but refreshing those who are different to us, and those who may be difficult for us as well. So my ask is, let's not think of the application from this message to do justice means serving at a food bank or a soup kitchen or something like that. And that is not to diminish the value and importance of those things, because when we look at our society and the current economic and social needs, that is so needed. But I think the point of this that Jesus is saying is actually, don't just get involved in projects and initiatives, but get to know people. Get to know people. Get to know and treat them for how God sees them. How does God see them? People they're of immeasurably worth because what they're made in his image. God sees how they are victims of injustice, and therefore he calls us to do what? To fling wide the doors of our homes and of our lives. And it's amazing because God isn't just telling us to do it, but he showed us how to do it. He did this himself. The incarnation, Jesus, God coming down to earth, is the model that we can follow. I love how Eugene Peterson in the Message translation puts it. The Word, Jesus, God, became flesh and blood. And what did he do? He moved into the neighborhood. Jesus experienced our whole world. He came near to us. He suffered like us. And where did he move? He could have moved anywhere. Into palaces, into riches. Where did he move? He moved near to the poor. And so that is the example that we have to follow. It cannot be done from a distance. And I'll never forget, just in my reading recently, I came across a story from a well-known American pastor called Calvin Miller. Hey, Babs. Ti'n iawn? Ti'n join any fama? Yeah? Da iawn. Back to Calvin Miller. He grew up in the middle of the Depression in America. And so he grew up in serious poverty. But he recalls, I just found this so challenging, he recalls never feeling particularly poor until the rich Christians came by at Christmas and dropped off baskets before trying to win us to the Lord, he said. And Miller comments, and this really convicted me. He said this: the last place you want to go worship is the place where the people need you to be poor so that they themselves can feel rich in the dispensation of their charity. If our service is done at a distance, if it is done with fallen motives, all we do is just add to people's feeling that poverty of being. But when we invite people for dinner, as Jesus said, when we invite them into our lives, into our homes, what are we doing? Well, we are affirming dignity and worth. We're recognizing around the table we are equals, and in the sight of God we are equals, and therefore we need to stop thinking just in those terms of being comfortable and predictable and at ease. We need to think more like Jesus. We need to buck the trend and be moving into neighborhoods where people aren't moving to. Why? Because I believe, and I think I see it in my own life, people, they're rarely, I shouldn't say never, because then whoever preaches and Owen and myself are out of jobs, but people are rarely preached into belief. It happens, it definitely does. People are rarely argued into belief. The most common way people come to know God as friend, as Saviour, is when they're loved into belief. So I believe this is just a challenge for us as the church, whole church, but especially here in Wales. I came across a programme on S4C recently called Pawb a'i Farn. Some of you who do speak Welsh might well know of Pawb a'i Farn. Pawb a'i Farn was recently filmed in Blaenau Ffestiniog, and the whole idea of Pawb a'i Farn is that they get local councillors and MPs into the room, and the local people can share their opinion. Pawb a'i Farn, everyone has an opinion. And I'll never forget just watching this clip of a mother who was from Blaenau, single mother of 4 kids, who had to say that I had to move away from Blaenau, closer to my work, because of the cost of living and of fuel. And yet I am still faced with the decision, and it's coming this winter, whether I turn the heating on or whether I feed my 4 kids. Now when I watched that, and I realised, this is not just someone from afar, this is someone who is from the town that we now live in. It moved me because I realised this is a reality. This is something that is going to become a real issue for many. We've enjoyed the hot weather, but there is a winter coming, and this is a reality that many will face. And so what will we do as the church? The question is, what does it mean for us? As a church, as a corporate body, but as also as individuals, to not invite our friends, our brothers, our sisters, or relatives, or our rich neighbours, but to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. And I came across one suggestion from a church leader who's doing something very similar in England, where he's leading a ministry of network of churches that are planting in council estates and poorer parts of the country. And this is what he said on Twitter: providing food in a warm room isn't going to be an opportunity for the church this winter. It's going to be a necessity. Families will be forced to make choices to feed their kids or keep warm. So let's create pop-up winter restaurants all over the UK. Now, I loved that kind of vision that he had, but it's just a reminder, isn't it? We can't have it both ways. We cannot be those guests who have been plucked up from the bottom, seated at the top by the host, and yet then not become hosts ourselves. Hospitality, loving the stranger, welcoming the poor, all of this proves the internal work of grace in our lives. It all shows what God has already done within us. And I just wanted to finish with just Luke. You can clearly tell this is a passion within him, because he then doesn't just go on to kind of labour this such key part of Jesus' message in his gospel, but actually He talks about it in Acts when he follows the story of the early church, and he notes that the early church, how could they be described? Well, this is the way he describes them. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them, all that there were no needy persons among them. That was just what I read there. I saw, yes, they come together. When God's grace is so powerfully at work in the church, in our life, when we gaze to the cross and are reminded of our own helplessness and need, what does that do? When we realize the host of the banquet has invited us, we can't but become hosts ourselves. And so there were no needy persons among them. And that really is just Luke riffing off an earlier quote from the Old Testament where God was giving Israel at the beginning of their story a host of laws given to them. Why? So that the needy, so that the poor, those on the outside would be protected. And so I'm reminded that the same calling to Israel then, the same example we see in the church in Acts, is what we should be longing for the church today. So what does the Lord require of you? Well, it's what really matters, what we've heard at the table this morning. That we walk humbly, and we love mercy, and that we act justly, and that we do that all the days of our lives. We're going to sing to finish, and we're going to sing just that wonderful hymn, When I Survey.